I'm Jennifer Della Quadri, and this is the Raising Happy Teens podcast, where you learn how to successfully guide your teenager into adulthood without losing your sanity in the process. Let's do this. Welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm going to be diving into part 2 of the book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. So if you didn't listen to last week's episode, you're going to want to go back and check it out because it does kind of lay the foundation for what I'm going to be talking about today. But you don't have to have heard it in order to understand what I'm going to be talking about. Either way, I recommend you listen to both episodes and you also check out the book. And also, I just wanted to say I've really been enjoying the conversations that I've had with some of you about the research that is presented in this book. We're all in this same situation here, raising kids with phones and just trying to figure it out as we go. And what I love is that everyone is just so open to the information. And maybe it's just my perception, but I feel like we have a community here where nobody is judging anyone else. We all know that we want to do best by our kids, and we're learning as we go. And that we can have really great, open, honest communication about how social media, how phone use, how screen time is impacting our kids' lives. And I've even been talking to my teen clients about it. The more you know, the better you can understand and the better decision making you can have around parenting kids and teens and phones, parenting with phones. So I was just watching this movie on Netflix called Unfrosted. It's just a silly movie, and you could go see it if you want. But it kind of made me think of this topic here, and I just thought I wanted to share some of the connections that I thought really came to my mind when I was watching this movie. So it's about cereal company wars in the 1960s. And it was funny because it really pokes fun at how sugary cereal was seen as healthy back then. It was like part of your nutritious breakfast. Sugar was healthy. And then people started to do some research and realized, that's not exactly true. But at the time, parents were feeding their kids a quote, healthy breakfast of sugary cereal and sending them off to school. And then when we realized collectively that sugary cereal may not actually be the healthiest breakfast, a lot of parents stopped providing it or limiting it. And it's still obviously very available. Just walk down the grocery store aisle, you'll see all those boxes of cereal. But a good percentage of families have stopped eating it or limit the amount that they provide. But that took time. So in our generation, we ate that sugary cereal. And sometimes, if you're anything like me, we even added extra sugar to it. Like when we had Rice Krispies or Cheerios that didn't have that added sugar, we added the sugar for it. But I have never bought sugary cereal for my kids. And if I had, maybe it was on vacation, but it's not a regular thing. And my belief is that it's going to be the same thing with access to phones and social media. It just begins with awareness of the negative effects. And then there's a small group of people who start to make a change. And then over time, there can be a big change. So that when our kids have kids, and hopefully it will be completely normal to not give your kid a phone until they turn 14 and not let them have social media until they're 16. And of course, it will always be there, but there will be more societal norms around it. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about the impact social media has on girls, as well as what is going on with boys. Haidt doesn't discuss non-binary teens specifically in his book, and he also doesn't address the impact on transgender teens. So for the purposes of this podcast, girls will refer to anyone who identifies as female, and boys will be those who identify as males. And I'm also aware that the research he's sharing is gender specific, But that doesn't mean that the other gender doesn't also struggle with these things. So, let me just begin by sharing the information he presents about social media and its impact on girls. And the big idea here is that social media harms girls more than it harms boys. And that's because, for the most part, girls use social media more than boys do. Boys gravitate toward YouTube or Reddit or playing online games. And girls are just heavier users of visually oriented platforms. And what he found is that there is a clear, consistent, and sizable link between heavy social media use and mental illness. Heavy being 4 or more hours a day. And there's actually a graph in the book that shows the percentage of clinically significant depression as it correlates with the number of hours spent on social media. And right around the 2 hours or more per day mark, there is a significant and rapid jump in percentage. So, according to that specific research, around that 2 hour per day mark, the impact is even greater. So, social media, for the purposes of this book, it's defined as sharing user generated content widely, and it's asynchronous. So, Height outlines 4 reasons why girls are particularly vulnerable to the impact of social media. The first one is that girls in general are more affected by visual and social comparison and also perfectionism. And we all know this, we've all grown up with this, but oftentimes, unfortunately, a girl's social standing is usually more tied to her beauty and her sex appeal than is the case for boys. And when girls are on social media, they're subjected more to severe and consistent judgments about their looks. And they're also exposed to beauty standards that are just far out of reach and further out of reach. So there's something that's referred to as socially prescribed perfectionism. I've talked about perfectionism a lot on this podcast, but I've mostly talked about it in that a person is very hard on themselves and it's self prescribed. But socially prescribed perfectionism is where someone feels they must live up to high expectations as prescribed by others. So that's a little bit different. Perfectionism, either way, in and of itself, increases anxiety. And when it comes to socially prescribed perfectionism, it's really the fear of public failure and the shame that would come along with it. And social comparison takes place outside of our awareness. This is something that's really interesting to know because it's something that we're not controlling. And so we all know, in theory, as adults and our teens know, in theory, that social media is not reality. But because the part of our brain that's doing the comparison is not governed by that logical side, the effect of that awareness is really limited. So you could say over and over, I know it's not real. I know this person's house is not real. They're using filters. But that part of our brain, that subconscious mind that is doing the comparison, isn't governed by the same part. So even that impact wouldn't be as great. And there's a quote in the book that I really wanted to share. And I feel like it perfectly describes how social media, the feeds are just curated to target that insecurity that everyone has. And knowing for specifically, we're talking about teen girls here, that is a really vulnerable time in life. And self esteem is typically pretty low in general. So here's the quote. Researchers for the Center of Countering Digital Hate created a dozen fake accounts on TikTok registered to 13-year-old girls and found that TikTok's algorithm served them tens of thousands of weight loss videos within a few weeks of joining the platform. So think about it. Legally, a 13-year-old is allowed to have a social media account, a TikTok account. And when they get on, their feed is curated specifically to them, a demographic that has low self-esteem already or sensitive to having what the other people think about them, is being force-fed this information. And I know I've had conversations with my teenagers about this, about the videos that they have seen that I've never seen because my feed is completely different than theirs. But videos like what a day on 500 calories looks like. Are they actively searching eating disorders? No. But because of their age, because of their gender, because maybe they watch one specific video on something, then they start getting fed these things. So you take that and you add on the use of filters, even AI, any altered perception of reality of what is beautiful is going to be impacted. And one study that was shared in this book, it showed that from 2011 to 2019, the percentage of high school girls who said that they were satisfied with themselves dropped from 68% to 56%, just in that span of 8 years. And this again was before COVID. And before then, from around 1991 to 2011, the percentage stayed pretty level and even. But when 2011 hit, it started to really grow. And it really dipped that 10% in that short period of time, right at the same time smartphones were invented or brought into the mass society, and also when social media was brought to the mass population. The second reason is that girls' aggression is more relational. And I've done a few podcasts on mean girls and relational bullying, but girls target other girls' social standing before they get into physical fights. And this is more easily done on social media because there's no buy-in on their relationship. So it's easy, even if it's someone you know, it's easy to beat them down in a cyber world than it is to do it even in school. And leaving comments or shaming someone on your social media, all that relational bullying is more accessible online and in social media. And the third reason is girls more easily share emotions and disorders. So think about mirroring. When you see someone laugh, you start to laugh. When you're seeing somebody cry, you might start to cry. So this is true for emotions, but it's also true for disorders. And it comes from that idea energy attracts like energy. And one statistic shows is that depression is more contagious than happiness. So when you're around somebody who is depressed, or when you're being exposed to somebody who is depressed, their mood will impact you more than being around somebody who is happy. That's what this study said. And people pick up the emotions of others. Like I mentioned, it's called emotional contagion. And there are, quote, influencers who are on social media that everybody is exposed to. And the way to gain more followers and become more well known is to be more extreme. So those who are presenting more extreme viewpoints or symptoms will get more attention, which makes them models that others look to for social learning. So you combine that with the emotional contagion, then that is where the tendency to pick up the moods and the viewpoints of others can really be skewed. And because girls are more easily prone to that, it's going to rub off on them. Also, anytime the algorithm picks up an interest in something, say you watch a video on mental health, you're going to be fed more and more content on that topic. And the fourth reason is that girls are more subject to harassment and predatory behavior. We all know this, but they're more vulnerable and they're more subject to it. So basically, when girls are on social media, their social lives are really impacted. And yes, it can be in a positive way, but really what's happening here is that they're having fewer deep conversations one on one with one or two special friends. And they're having more surface conversations with people that they don't know as well or they're not as connected with, kind of like fair weather friends. So they may have a ton of friends that they don't really know versus one or two friends that they don't know really, really well. So it went from quality over quantity to quantity over quality. And what's interesting and also not surprising is that loneliness really surged for everyone, but especially for teenage girls. Now I'm going to dive into the impact that all of this is having on boys. And it's not in as big of numbers as girls, but boys too have shown an increase in depression and in anxiety. And boys were beginning to show signs of disengaging from the real world before the introduction of smartphones. But Haidt, the author, he has these conclusions about why this is actually happening. And they're more speculative, but he does go into some theories into his book. One of the reasons he speculates is due to the global economy, because it's no longer rewarding physical strength. And that, along with an educational system that rewards the ability to sit and listen, has a great impact on boys' confidence. There's a book called Of Boys and Men. It's written by Richard Reeves. And he found that at every level of education, from kindergarten all the way through getting a PhD, boys were getting lower grades and had higher rates of ADHD, and that they're also less likely to graduate from high school, partly because they're 3 times more likely than girls to be suspended or expelled. And these gender differences are apparent in wealthier families and become larger moving down as you move down the socioeconomic ladder. So you take that and then partner it with the rise of safetyism, so being overprotective as parents and as a society, that affects boys more because they're more likely to engage in rough and tumble play or risky play. And when they're over supervised, it really shortens that outside rough and tumble playtime that boys need and grow confident from and learn how to become self-reliant and can really get the physicality out. So they're really being stifled there. Also, on top of that, they're being pulled inside by video games and smartphones. So there's less face-to-face interaction. And all of this leads boys to be more fragile, fearful, and risk averse. And it showed in this book that rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm, and suicide began rising in boys in the Western world. And in 2015, a staggering number were feeling lonely with no meaning or direction in their lives. And in this book, the topic of failure to launch comes up. This is a big problem that a lot of parents who have boys specifically worry about because there's no drive to get out of the house. They're lacking confidence and the self-esteem and the belief that they're going to be able to make it out on their own. So they don't leave the house. They stay home. And overall, in general, Gen Z is doing less of the bad stuff, quote unquote, that teens did in the past. Things like drinking, less car accidents, speeding tickets, fighting, unplanned pregnancies. All of those numbers have gone down. And this is not because Gen Z is wiser, although they may be. It's because they're withdrawing from the physical world. And you may be seeing this in your life as well, whether it's with your kids or with other teenagers. They're not getting together as much. They're not going out as much. They're not driving as much. So they're not going to have as many car accidents. They're not getting out and doing risky things. So they're not prone to getting into dangerous situations. And this happens with both the boys and the girls. But one difference when it comes to boys is that the virtual world consumes boys. They get hooked on games and on gaming. And some boys use video games to strengthen their social circle, and some use games to retreat to their bedroom. And they also have access to pornography, which impacts their desire to get out and engage in the risk of actually meeting someone in person. And in this book, he goes into really great detail on the impact of the accessibility of pornography and how it's impacting boys' drives to just get out of the house and do that uncomfortable, awkward thing, like getting to know someone. It's right there for them. So why bother doing the harder thing by getting out and meeting someone? And boys are more prone to becoming addicted to porn as well, which can impact their availability for a real life partner. And then on the topic of video games, the evidence isn't really as clear, but Haidt says that at least two major harms are associated with them. Number one is that they can cause problems for heavy users like loneliness. So to avoid feeling the loneliness, they turn to gaming, which becomes a vicious cycle. So they're relying on games rather than forming friendships to combat the loneliness, which results in long-term stress, anxiety, and symptoms of depression. And the second is that there's really an opportunity cost of taking up this enormous amount of time. And this is time that's not spent sleeping, exercising, interacting with family, and just participating in in-person activities. That huge loss of time. Although your son may disagree with you that it's a loss of time. And one big finding that, to me, really sums up the struggles boys are facing is the feeling that many boys have that life is meaningless. And this is just really heartbreaking. But in one study on this topic, it showed that the percentage of boys who agreed with this statement that life often feels meaningless went from 12% to 20% from 2012 to 2018. And this was before the pandemic. And when I work with the boys that I work with, they share that same sentiment and they get confused by it. And I think part of that confusion is because their parents didn't grow up with that life often feels meaningless mentality. The parents don't understand. And so the boys think, gosh, there must be something wrong with me for feeling this way. What am I doing wrong? But it's really a collective problem. Now, I've talked a lot about the problems, like a lot, and it's heavy, I know. But he does offer some really great solutions in this book. I'll talk in general about collective action solutions, and then I'm going to dive into what he recommends for parents to do. The big one, when it comes to us as a society, is basically just everybody deciding as a group to wait until a certain age to introduce smartphones. So that would impact social norms, like make it morally wrong to have a young kid on a phone. And having better tech solutions like age verification methods or better basic phones. And also having really good laws and rules in place requiring all social media companies verify ages of new users. And he makes a point in this book, and I 100% agree with this, recognizing that every child and every family and every school is unique. And so all of these principles that he's drawing on are universally applicable, but the solutions for how to implement may not be right for everyone. And I am on board with this as well. I love the collective idea, but I also highly recognize that everyone's family is going to be different. Everyone's kids are going to need something different. And that's where you as a parent get to decide what you want to do. So he's going to make these recommendations and I'm going to tell you what I think about them, but ultimately it's your decision. It's what you get to decide to do. So he dives a little bit into, and I also wanted to add, he does have some supplements on the things that he's talking about on his website, theanxiousgeneration.com. Definitely head there and look at the supplements. He recommends that the government encourage phone-free schools. Man, I could not agree with this more. And I also agree with taking the iPads out of education. I have talked about this before, but I started teaching before there were iPads. There was maybe a couple of desktop computers in the classroom, but they didn't work very well. They were often broken, and maybe it was just to practice typing, all the way to when every kid had an iPad. The availability of the kids and their ability to focus was so highly impacted. So I encourage that as well. I agree with that. Also, really stop punishing parents for giving children real world freedoms and just encourage more play in school. Also, I love this too, is just having more vocational education, apprenticeships, youth development programs, all of those things. So good. Now, here's where you come in. These are the things that he recommends that parents could do to help lessen the impact. And he starts with young children age 0 to 5. I'm not going to talk too much about that, but basically, it's just more and better experience in the real world and less and better experience on screens, just in general. Then when it comes to children ages 6 to 13, same, more and better experiences in the real world. So things like letting your kids out of your sight without them having a way to reach you, encouraging sleepovers, don't micromanage, encouraging walking to school in a group, having after school free play, meaning hanging out with other kids, doing things like going camping, finding a sleepaway camp that has no devices and doesn't rely on safetyism, and form child-friendly neighborhoods. When you hear that, you may be having parental anxiety, and I want to recognize that that is 100% a thing. So when if you think about, oh my gosh, my kid going out of the neighborhood without their phone or without any way to reach me, I feel like I'm going to have an anxiety attack thinking about that. What happens? What happens? Start slow. Give a little bit of freedom, let them experience it, then give a little bit more. And what that does is it makes you feel less and less anxious because then you learn to trust them and you learn to believe that they can handle it. And also for this age group, less and better experience on screens. So his recommendation is no more than 2 hours per day, depending on what it is and how it's used. And of course, on the child's individual traits. So younger would be more educational content and used, of course, in common areas. So that would mean for parents learning how to use parental controls and focusing on maximizing in-person activity and sleep than total screen hours. So that's the number one priority. Also, having clear structure to the day and week. Meals are phone free. Having a regular family movie night. All the devices put away at least 30 minutes before scheduled bedtime. I personally recommend at least an hour. Consider taking a day or even a week off here and there as a digital detox. And always keep an eye out for addiction or problematic use that interferes with daily routines or friendships or commitments. Cravings to check social media, lying and deceptive behavior, all of that would get in the way of their ability to socialize in the real world. And he recommends delaying the opening of a social media account to 16. If I could go back and I could do this again, I would 100% agree with that. I'm talking with you as a parent who's been through it. If I could go back and not allow my kids to have social media until 16, I would do it. I probably would have to get everybody around me on board too to make it in an ideal world. I wish I could, but I can't. And if you're like me and you're like, well, they already have social media, so oh well, you can still have open conversations with it. All is not lost. So always talk with them about the risks and, of course, listen to their thoughts. Then he moves on to how to manage teens who are age 13 to 18. So, again, more and better real world experience. So, increased mobility. That can mean driving, biking, getting out and about, and having a quote third place. I've talked with this about this on the podcast as well. A place that's not home and not school. Also, rely more on your teen at home. So, cooking, cleaning, running errands, all of those things. Encourage them to find a part time job. Find ways for them to nurture and lead, specifically caring for young children. That's a great way for kids, teens to build confidence. He mentions a high school exchange program, really great. Also, bigger thrills in nature, things like backpacking, rock climbing, canoeing, hiking, swimming, spending a month or longer with organizations. I have some clients who have teens who are doing that this summer. Highly recommend that. Also, one of the things that I loved so much is he recommends taking a gap year after high school. They are not damaging their college prospects and their future by doing this. What they're doing is they're improving their chances of finding a path that they actually want to pursue. So don't postpone the transition. That's not what this is about. It's about accelerating it by building the skills and the responsibility and the independence while they can. And then also back to screens, less and better experience on screens, better phone habits, and when and where to use them. So that is the summation of the information in this book. I love the outline. I love the data and the research. It's really opened my eyes, and hopefully it's opened yours as well. And I wanted to wrap all of this up by sharing a quote that's in the book that I could not have said better myself. Here it is. Quote, whether we think of the phone as the world's longest umbilical cord or as a, quote, invisible fence, childhood autonomy plummeted when kids started carrying them. Even if a parent rarely looks at the tracker, and even if a kid never summons mom to come get him because his bike chain broke, the fact that this is always possible makes it more difficult for children and adolescents to feel that they are on their own, trusted, and competent. And it makes it more difficult for parents to let go. I will probably record a podcast in the future about the anxiety that comes from letting go and the anxiety that comes with having that umbilical cord constantly connected, because that's also a big challenge for parents and for teens. I would love to hear what you think about this episode. I would love to hear what you think about this book. Hit me up on Instagram at jennifer.delaquadri. Leave a comment below. I would love to connect with you. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. If you liked this episode, I'd like to invite you to join Raising Happy Teens, my free online community for parents of teenagers, where every week I host Ask a Coach. You bring your parenting questions, and I provide expert advice and coaching. Click the link in the show notes to join today. I'll see you inside.